Hey everyone, Sean Frangella here with a new Cinema 4D tutorial for PremiumBeat.com on how to make this 3D video billboard with some lights dancing around on it and some other cool effects. So here's a render of this whole project that we'll be working towards, and what's cool about this one is you can see that there's some light actually dancing around and kind of moving around on this billboard. And if we look at our project file, we're doing some cool stuff with luminance textures using global illumination, as well as some light, which when put together all ends up with some pretty cool stuff and some pretty cool renders. And then what we got going on for the actual billboard is this one's a video, so it's a video of a different tutorial I put together because I thought I was being clever, or it could be an image. So we'll work towards this whole render as a project and build this thing in a smart way. So let's get started. In Cinema 4D, I'm just going to do File, New, and what we want to do is build out this billboard first, and then we'll add some lights and textures and kind of go from there. So in my new file, for that main billboard, I'll just grab a cylinder and I'll go to display line so I can see my grids. And I'm going to make this 100 and just scale it in. And then to get it to sit straight on the grid, I'm going to set Y to 50. And since it's 100, it's going to snap that there. And you might as well put a floor in now up here under floor, because we'll use that later. And then for the legs of this, rather than copying this and having to worry about it lining up exactly, what we can do to keep this in the center of our scene but add two of them is I'm going to grab the cylinder, and I'll grab a cloner and I'll put the cylinder in the cloner so it clones it. But what I want to do with the cloner is I'm going to change it to mode grid array, and then I don't need a whole bunch of pillars, I just need two, so I'll change it to 2, 1, 1. And then that same thing with the cloner, I could just put that 50 centimeters up and I'll snap back to the ground. And what's nice about this is we created this set of pillars and we can just scale in on X, so we could get it to like 100 or 150, and it's always going to scale from the center point, which is the center of our scene. And then we don't have to worry about lining it up, and we know it all line up correctly. So then let's build kind of the floor of that and then the billboard, and then we'll build some lights. So for the floor of that, I'm going to grab a cube and I'll just scale that down on the top. And this is again why it's useful that we're doing everything straight from the center. And I'll just scale this up, and I can get rid of my little arrows ever if I want to by pressing Option D. If they're ever in the way, like way out here and I can't grab those little orange dots. And then I'll just scale this down, and I can press Option D to get them back. And then I'll just put this straight on top. And then I can just put it back up here on top, and with this little floor post, I'll add fillet cap so it's kind of rounded, but then take it down to 0.5 centimeters. So it's just a little beveled on there. So we just get kind of a little flat surface, and we can line that up exactly in our other view. And we want it to be big enough so it's sticking out a little. So I'll just line that up. And then for the back post, I can just duplicate that. So I'll just hold Command, and then I can rotate it with R, and then just move it to the back, scale it up quite a bit because that'll be our big video or still billboard image. And now let's build those lights. This is all basic shapes and nothing too interesting here, but let's build some of those lights. And real quick, this looks a little wide, so I'll just take this in, pull this out. Okay, so now let's build those lights. If we look at my scene that's finished, again, what's cool about this is there's these lights, and they actually have light bulbs in them, and they're shooting light, and there's actual lights in Cinema 4D that are shooting light up, and it's all happening, and it results in this pretty cool effect. So what I'm going to do back in my main scene is I'm going to grab a sphere, and I'll scale that to the size of my main light. So I'll just pull that down, and I can move it up into place, and I'll probably have to move it again later, but that's fine. And what I'm going to do to get that kind of bulb shape is I'm going to duplicate that sphere again and just drag it up. And then I'm going to grab a bool object up here and put both of the spheres in it. And then I'll have to switch the order of these because it's cutting the opposite of what I want now. And what this is going to do is cut that top sphere out of the other one. And since these are spheres that always render perfectly, and those will look nice, and then I can adjust this on the top and pull this bottom one down to get exactly where I want. I kind of like it about right there. So we get this nice, cool little sunken shape. And then to get the main light, that'll be our little bulb. I can just copy that outside of the bowl, and I'll scale this down. And then I can just look from one of my side views, and we can see here where that circle is intersecting and where I can sit that in there. So it's a simple technique, but you can get some pretty cool stuff when you figure cutting spheres out of spheres. Then what I can do is just rename this light, and I'll call this container. And it looks like the axis got kind of off, so I can go to mesh, axis center, and just include children and objects. And if that isn't working, I can always press L, and I just wanted to move this back into place, so I can just move my anchor point back into place. So this usually works, sometimes it doesn't, and if it doesn't, you can always press L or use this little enable access button. So now we got our light. We want to point it at the billboard, so I'll put both of these in a null, so I'll right click group objects or option G, and I'll call this light null, and that'll be our main light. And then I can rotate that to look up at this, and what I need is just a post. So I'll actually just grab this cube, which I'll call floor post, and I'll call this one billboard, and I'll grab that bottom one and just hold command to make a duplicate, so then it's the same scale and everything, but I can just slide it out. And then on the edges, I'm going to just pull it way in. And I know that these are all centered, so it will line up, which is nice. So then I can just get my light null and press W to switch between my world and local orientation. And I'll just drop this right on top of this post. And that way we can have this light being held up by this little bar that's right below it, and assume it's all kind of drilled together. So now what we could do is use a similar technique to get a bunch of these from this cloner. And actually, since we made a cloner and it's already on grid array, we can just duplicate this whole cloner. So I'll hold command and drag up, delete the cylinder, and then I'll grab this light and what I'll rename light post. I'll grab both of those, put those into a group, so option G, because I want to clone this whole thing. I'll call this full light. And then I'll drag this into the cloner, and since it's already set to those settings, it'll already do that, and I can just turn it up a couple times, so like 5, and then just drag my cloner out on the top and get it back up. And then very easily, without having to make another cloner and change all the settings, I have a grid array of clones of those lights, which again is all set to line up exactly, so I don't have to worry about it matching up evenly on the edges. It's going to do that automatically because we're always building from the origin point. So there's kind of our basic shape, just some simple things, but let's do some cool stuff with lights, textures, and cameras for this one. So let's first set up our render settings. So right now it's just on the default. Let's go to render settings, and we're going to turn on physical and ambient occlusion, and we'll turn on global illumination now, and we might turn it on and off as we're working, but that's what'll really give us some cool effects. And then I'll make a camera, and I'll turn this on. And for this one, I want to use a wide angle camera. So down here on focal length, I'm going to put it at 20. Which will give us this warped fisheye perspective, which I find is really useful in motion graphics. And I forgot one thing on our render settings. Let's set it at 960 by 540, which is half of 1920 by 1080. So that'll give us the aspect ratio that we want. And then we can just line up our camera to get a nice shot where this billboard looks really big and heroic. So now what we want to do is set up some cool lights and textures that'll really make this thing look pretty nice. So what I'm going to do is have a main texture on all of this, have a texture on the bulb, and have a texture on just the front polygon of our billboard. So down here in my textures, I'll create one and call that main. So just double click and then double click to get the properties. I'll call this main texture. And this one, I'm just going to have kind of a dark gray, and I'll have reflection, but change it to Fresnel. So it's just a little reflective. And then this one, I'll add a bump. So it gives it a little bit of graininess and material. And for texture, I'll go to noise, and I can click on noise, and I'll go down here and pick one of these. I kind of like this one because it looks kind of industrial, but it's way too high by default. So I got to go to bump and go to strength and put it at something low and probably just like 1 or 2. So let's go to 1, maybe 1.5. And we just need a little bit, and we'll use that for our main texture. Now let's make another one, and this will be our light bulb. So I'll call this bulb. And for this, we want to use luminance, and we'll turn this way up actually. And we'll end up changing this later to see exactly what's happening, but let's put this at like 1,000 and give it a little bit of color. And since we have global illumination on, this will be actually shooting light. So what I want to do is I'm going to texture our bulb here. And again, since it's in a cloner, it's nice because it'll repeat in all of them. So I'm going to go to my light sphere, which is just my main sphere, and I'll drag this bulb texture onto there. And that's going to be my texture. And just to see what that's doing by itself, if I do a quick render, you can see that the global illumination pass will go. And we can see that we're getting, even though we don't have lights in our scene, some extra light bouncing off this little circle container and kind of shooting around and breaking up. And since it's in this little container, we get some cool effects, and then it's hitting our billboard. So some nice stuff, some really interesting effects that happens when you put it in these little containers, and figure it, we're using them as they were actually light bulbs. And what I want to do is have that steel bumpy material on everything except this front polygon. So what I'm going to do is on our billboard, press C to make that editable. And then I can go to our polygon mode. And on this billboard, I'm going to go to my live selection and select just this front. And then to get everything else, I can press U to get my selection tools and press I for invert. And that's going to select everything else, which is really useful because then I can just drag this main texture onto the billboard in the viewport, and it's going to texture all of that selection except the front. So now if I create another one, let's call this our screen or our image or whatever. And for color, we'd want to grab our image. So I thought it'd be funny to grab a different tutorial that I did a couple weeks ago of the skyscraper tutorial. And that'll be our playing texture. And now since I already have this selected, or if I accidentally drop the selection, I can double click the selection tag. And I can do the same thing I just did. I can do UI, and that's going to give me just this one. And that's the only reason that I'm not doing this whole thing in a null, is because I want to be really particular about this. And then I can drag the screen onto here. And if I go ahead later in time and double click this texture, go to editor, animated preview, it's going to show up as this playing video on just that one little flat panel. So it's really useful to use selection tags for those sorts of things, as well as save them in case I ever need to get back to it. Now, what we can do for the rest of them is I'll take all of my stuff now and I'll put all of it in a group. So I'll just do Option G, and this is my whole billboard. And then if I drag this main texture, it's going to texture everything that isn't already textured, which is really useful because then it's going to drop it down to everything that I haven't textured and skip over our screen and our bulb. So now without lights, if we do a quick render on this, we can see that we're getting some nice light emitting from the luminance channel of this texture and bouncing around because global illumination is on. And that's just from the lights coming out of the bulbs and hitting all these spheres in the billboard. And we haven't even added lights for our scene yet. So let's add those, and let's add a nice little camera move to make this an interesting little animation of our shot. And to add to that, let's now add in an extra actual light in here, because now we have our luminance channel, but let's see what happens when we have a light. And let's just save this render real quick for comparison. So I'll do a Shift R for my camera view of what we just saw. So that's where we are now. And then let's put an actual light in here. So we have our luminance channel. Let's grab a spotlight if we figure it's an actual billboard. And then we can go into our billboard and let's turn off the cloner for the lights because I just want to see the main one. And then I'm going to take this spotlight and put it where that light actually is in the container. So I'll move it over here, move it actually into that little container. And you can see now that's lighting our billboard too. And then I'll rotate that up at the angle that the light is pointed. And we can just position this a little if we want to be really specific and make sure it's on the front of that bulb. And then turn the cloner back on. And remember to put this inside of what's being cloned. So I'll put this inside of full light. And now we're going to get the 5 lights cloned exactly where those are. And now if I go to my lights in there, I can change the color a little, make it kind of a light orange, turn up the intensity, turn on shadows if I want, and then it's going to hit all of them, rotate it up, and then I can go to the light, and if I go to details, I can change the inner angle and outer angle. So this is the softness. So if it was inner angle, outer angle, the same number, we're gonna get no softness and diffusion. So we can kind of pull this out. And then if we go back to our camera view, if we add up these two effects of our lights on global illumination, these actual lights, and do a render, we can see by comparison that's really helping to even out our lights. So we can still get those nice little bouncing around effects because of the GI, but we also get some realistic spotlights that would look like this. And it's a pretty cool technique. You should think about this stuff if we're actually mimicking practical lights that we'd be seeing in a shot and we want it to look like it's actually lit. So now what we can do is add our main lights of our scene and kind of balance this out, turn on some shadows, get a nice shot. So I'll get out of my camera view and kind of zoom out and look for my 4 views. And let's just add some lights around our scene and we can light this and make it look interesting. So I'll add one just regular point light. And this could be my key light. So I'll put this over here, put it up a little and in front of my billboard. And on that light, I'll go to general, give it a little bit of a bluish hue, and add shadow soft. And let's duplicate that one. So I'll command and drag to the left. And let's move this one down. And we'll see how these kind of look together. We'll make this one a little orange. And it's always good to work with just subtle shades of color. Balance out your lights like you would in practical lighting. And now if we take a look at this, we'll do another quick render for comparison with just some basic lights. And we can see we're getting some nice balance from different colored of very subtle lights on the left and right. And we might just want to tone down one of them just to kind of balance it out. And it looks like there's an actual, for sure, key light. On that blue one, it's going to move that further away and put that at like 50. And now let's just do a basic camera move on our scene. So let's grab a camera. And rather than moving that and keyframing it, let's put our camera into a null. Which, again, just another point why it's great that we're keeping our object and scene on the origin. Rather than moving our camera around and trying to really control it, if I create a null, so create object null, that's going to be at the 0 point of our scene. So now if I make the camera child of that and rotate the null, the camera's going to rotate exactly around that center, which is where our object is. So now if I wanted to animate this camera in kind of a nice way, it's going to come out really smooth and really accurate. So what I could do is on this null, I'll put a keyframe at the end here, so this will be our end position, and I'll turn on just rotation, make a keyframe, and then go to the beginning of our shot. And then I can just swing this camera around, make a keyframe, and now we have our camera animating smoothly. If we wanted our actual camera to track in while it's doing this, what we could do is grab our camera, and I'll do keyframes on just the position of the camera. So say that the camera starts out a bit lower, and we'll set a keyframe, and then at the end, it's a bit higher and a bit further in. We can press W for our world axis, and it's always going to point because that's the way the camera's pointing. So we can then make another keyframe, and now if we go to the beginning, we have this really nice, smooth camera animation that you'd need a lot of control to actually pull off in a studio. So you need tracks and a rig or a camera crane. And now we can get this nice, controlled, accurate camera animation where it's not just kind of flying all over there. It's rotating exactly from this point and smoothly animating. So getting nice, smooth camera motion can really make a big difference when we're doing smooth 3D animation on scenes like this. And if we do a quick render on this last frame, we can see that we have a pretty nice shot. Our model's looking good, and a lot of it is the lighting and textures. And we could keep tweaking the textures, keep pushing, maybe redo this bump and make it look not so veiny, but it's a good start, and it's a good overview of working with these lighting techniques, getting our model done, and then considering how do we actually bounce light around and how do we set up a cool scene, control our lighting and textures, and have some nice smooth camera animation. And from there you could just render out the whole scene and we'd get to something close to this, which I rendered out for our full animation with the video kind of starting and turning on and that light bouncing around in a really cool way. So this has been Sean Frangella showing you how to make this 3D billboard shot and scene. Be sure to stop by premiumbeat.com for all your music and sound effect needs, and check out the blog on premiumbeat.com for tips and tricks on Cinema 4D, After Effects, and other animation apps. And if you want to see more of what I do, you can check out my site at seanfrangella.com and subscribe on youtube.com/seanfrangella, and hit me up on Twitter at /seanfrangella. And as always, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to all premium Beat.com channels on YouTube and Vimeo to get more animation tutorials. And I will see you at the next video.